Welcome back. This module from the course on community rights and forest governance, as you know, is about the laws that govern the use of forests. In the first lecture of this module, we learned how governments establish control over Indian forests through a set of laws that restrict the ability of private persons to use forests. We also learned how the governments of colonial and independent India wanted to use their control over forests to use them in accordance with their priorities. In this lecture, you will learn the laws that govern how the government determines how forests in its control are managed and used. We learned that governments have powers under the Indian Forest Act to permit some rights to be exercised, meaning permit some kinds of human activity in reserve forests and limit the exercise of some rights, meaning restrict some kinds of human activity in protected forests. Governments also have powers to make rules for the exercise of rights and for a number of activities related to the use of protected forests, including the cutting and collection of timber and a system of licensing for it, the collection and manufacture of forest produce, and a system of licensing for it, the clearing and breaking up of land for cultivation, and the cutting of grass and pasturing of cattle. These powers of the state governments are administered by their forest departments. Under the Bombay Forest Rules, for example, the grazing of cattle is prohibited on reserved or protected forests, except in areas assigned specifically for that purpose under orders of the forest department officials and with a permit from the department. Similarly, under the Orissa Forest Grazing of Cattle Rules 1980, divisional forest officers have powers to declare some forests closed for grazing from time to time. They also have powers to issue permits for grazing in areas of reserve forests, which are ordinarily closed for grazing. Let's try to broadly understand the powers of forest departments. To come back to the example of the Bombay Forest Rules, which are now part of the Maharashtra Forest Manual, the Chief Conservator of Forests is, as the head of the state's forest department, empowered to deal with all purely technical matters relating to the administration of forests. Similarly, the Andhra Pradesh Forest Department Code gives responsibility for the general administration of reserve forests, protected forests, and other land placed under the control of the forest department in the state to the principal chief conservator of forests, who is the head of the state's forest department. The Kerala Forest Code gives charge of the general administration and control of government forests in Kerala to the chief conservator of forests. These examples illustrate the source of the power of forest departments to administer forests for some specific purposes. These purposes include the commercial harvesting of timber on a large scale. The word administration that we see in these contexts usually refers to the organization of people and resources to achieve some goals or purposes. So now, let's understand how these goals are determined. Under the Kerala Forest Code, divisional forest officers must prepare an annual plan of operations for each range over which they have administrative authority. These annual plans are scrutinized and consolidated by the conservator of forests, who then sends it to the chief conservator for approval. The chief conservator then has to prepare a detailed list of all the work that is approved in each circle, showing the funds allocated for each item of work. In Andhra Pradesh also, an annual plan has to be drawn up by the divisional forest officer, keeping the range as the unit of administration. The conservator of forests to whom these plans are submitted will, if necessary, modify the plan and communicate the sanctioned orders to the divisional forest officer. The budget of the forest department will be framed on the basis of the consolidated annual plan of operations received from the conservator of forests. The range, the division, and the circle are administrative units of increasing size. Several ranges comprise a division, and a number of divisions comprise a circle. But while the day-to-day work of a forest department is conducted in accordance with annual plans, the primary documents that guide state governments in the exercise of their powers to administer forests is the working plan. Working plans are aimed at longer-term consistency in the management of forests and, most critically, at ensuring that forest resources are not used up at a rate faster than they can be regenerated. To put it more simply, working plans state the long-term goals of forest departments in relation to units of forests. Let's now learn about them in some detail. Forests in India are managed in accordance with working plans that guide the forest department's work in an area of forest, usually an administrative unit known as a division, for a specific duration such as 10 years. Forest departments in India have adopted the scientific practice of silviculture to control the growth, composition, health, and quality of forests to meet diverse needs and values. Working plans evaluate the status of forests and biodiversity resources of an area, assess the impact of previous management practices, and, depending on any economic or protective objectives, determine suitable management interventions for the future. In managing a forest, continuity of action over a longer term is important because forests take time to mature. The National Forest Policy warns against managing any forest without a working plan approved by a competent authority. This was reiterated when the Supreme Court prohibited in 1996 commercial harvesting in all forests unless it was in accordance with the working plan approved by the central government. There is a larger context to this Supreme Court decision that we will learn later in this lecture. Following the Supreme Court's interventions, the state and central governments worked together to develop working plans. An authority designated under the National Working Plan Code by the Union Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change approves the working plan on behalf of the central government and also monitors its implementation. The National Working Plan Code of 2014 identifies the Regional Additional Principal Chief Conservator of Forests, or the RAPCCF, of the ministry as this authority. Currently, the ministry has 10 regional offices in charge of different states. The National Working Plan Code of the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change is the document that sets out a standard format for all working plans across all states and union territories in India, a standard process for drafting a working plan, and a process for ensuring that no working plans are implemented without the approval of the central government. While preparing a working plan, an officer of the State Forest Department known as the Working Plan Officer surveys and maps the area to create a record of the climate and soil and other ecological factors that operate in the area and the rights for that area. Of late, tools like remote sensing, GIS, and GPS are being used for preparing the forest cover maps. The Working Plan Officer's report recommends the forest management practices considered most suitable for the area and is submitted to a superior officer in charge of working plans for the forests in the entire state, generally the conservator of working plans. Based on suggestions collected from a standing consultative committee where both the state and central forest departments are represented, regarding this report, the working plan officer starts working on the draft working plan. The draft working plan must have two parts. The first provides the relevant information about the forest area, including the systems of management used in the past and the statistics of growth and yield. The second part, based on that information, charts the future course of action. It will describe, among other things, the systems of management to be used, how the administration for the area will be staffed, and the plans and projections for timber harvests. The members of the Standing Consultative Committee, and in particular the RAPCCF, examines this draft and provides their comments. The draft is modified in accordance with the opinions accepted in the meetings of the committee and is then sent to the RAPCCF by the state government through its forest department. Once the RAPCCF approves it on behalf of the MOEF along with any suggestions, directions and modifications, the plan can be considered final. Any change that has to be made to the working plan after that, which permanently alters the basis of management laid down in it, such as any clear felling of natural forest or large-scale felling due to natural calamities that cannot be adjusted against the future yield, will require the prior sanction of the RAPCCF. A mid-term review may assess the progress made in implementation of any working plan, review difficulties, and recommend changes where required. The National Working Plan Code recommends that all working plans should be in consonance with general village-based planning. For the involvement and benefit of local stakeholders, micro plans have to be prepared. To understand what micro plans are, we need to first learn about Joint Forest Management, or JFM, and the implications of the National Forest Policy of 1988. We will do that in detail later in this module. For now, however, it is only important to understand that the National Working Plan Code says that micro plans must be prepared by JFM committees, which are committees at the village level, with the technical assistance of the forest staff as per their contract with the forest department. For sharing the responsibilities of implementation and equitable sharing of those forest products that can be harvested without cutting down trees or altering the forest itself, but within the broad prescriptions of the forest department's working plan. We also need to note at this stage that the entire structure of JFM is built on top of a national forest policy. Such a policy cannot confer any rights that can be claimed before a court. Even some of the state laws that have actually recognized JFM committees have not yet been implemented. To recap what we have learned so far, forest departments have powers to administer forests, but they can only do so in accordance with working plans prepared under the supervision of the state and central governments. But this only applies to the administration of forests for a purpose that does not change the nature of the forest itself. No working plan can be aimed, for example, at the felling of trees to build a dam or a power plant on that land. Another aspect of managing forests is the use of the biological resources on forest land. These biological resources do not fall within the definition of timber or even minor forest produce. For example, the leaves, bark, or flowers of plants, herbs, fungi, and trees can be valuable for medical research, and the knowledge from that research can then be commercially utilized in medicinal products. India's Biological Diversity Act 2002 places strict restrictions on who can access the biological resources occurring in India or knowledge related to those resources for research or for commercial utilization. It regulates the transfer of the results of any research into these resources and the grant of any intellectual property rights based on information or knowledge about these resources. The restrictions put in place by this law are enforced through criminal law. This means, for example, that people who are restricted from accessing or transferring biological resources and knowledge related to those resources under this law, such as foreign nationals or the executives of foreign corporations, can be punished with imprisonment for up to 5 years if they do so. To exercise these regulatory functions, the law establishes a National Biodiversity Authority and biodiversity boards in all the states. So, the National Biodiversity Authority and the various boards are also important parts of the administrative machinery that manage forests. Among the objectives of the Biological Diversity Act 2002 is the equitable sharing of the benefits arising from biological resources and traditional knowledge. Later in this module, we will learn how forest-dwelling communities can claim benefits from the exploitation of the biological resources in forests. So far, we have learned about how governments manage forest land and forest resources through the planned pursuit of forestry. But governments also have powers to divert forest land for completely unrelated purposes, meaning use the land for purposes that have nothing to do with forestry. Forest land can be used for infrastructural projects like power plants and roads, mines, and even development projects such as schools and hospitals. Let's now learn what laws guide the government's power to use forest land for non-forest purposes such as these. Under the Forest Conservation Act 1980, the approval of the central government, which will act upon the advice of a forest advisory committee set up under this law, is mandatory for A. Using a forest for a non-forest purpose, dereservation of reserve forests, leasing of forest lands to industries and individuals, known as diversion, and clear felling of trees, which is when nearly all trees in an area are uniformly cut down. The law does not itself ban any non-forest activity or the dereservation of forest land. It only requires state governments to first secure the central government's permission before it authorizes any of these changes to the use of forests. Non-forest purpose means the breaking up or clearing of any forest land or any portion of forest land for one, the cultivation of tea, coffee, spices, rubber, palms, oil-bearing plants, horticultural plants, and medicinal plants, or two, any other purpose other than reforestation, which is the planting of trees in depleted forest areas. But it does not include any work relating to or ancillary to conservation, development, and management of forests and wildlife. The procedure for seeking the central government's approval under the Forest Conservation Act is set out under the Forest Conservation Rules. Any proposal made by any person, organization, company, or government department that wants to get the central government's approval under the Forest Conservation Act for diversion or denotification of forest land for any non-forest purpose, or for using forest land for any non-forest purpose, must follow this procedure. Proposals for diversion of forest land for non-forest purposes reach the central government's Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change from various states and union territories. These are examined and either approved or rejected. The procedure can thus be divided into three broad stages. You can read about the details of each stage in the reading materials for this module, but we can go over the main features now. Before the state government considers the proposal, two steps must be taken. First, the divisional forest officer for the area must check the feasibility of the proposal, carry out site inspections, and count the trees in the area. Second, the district collector must ensure that the process of recognition and vesting of rights under the Forest Rights Act, about which we will learn later in this module, has been completed in that area and obtain the written permission of the Gram Sabha that has jurisdiction over the forest area in question for the proposal and for any measures to ameliorate or compensate for the damage that would be caused to the forest. Depending on the amount of forest land in question and the type of land use proposed, different types of proposals go through different levels of scrutiny, at the end of which the central government decides to grant or not grant its in-principle approval. This in-principle approval is given along with a set of conditions that the user agency must fulfill. In the third stage, a proposal receives the central government's final approval. For that, the user agency must demonstrate that it has 1. Fulfilled the conditions under which the central government's in-principle approval was given, and 2. Paid all the relevant amounts of compensation, including the fees for compensatory afforestation, net present value, the cost of implementation of the catchment area treatment plan, the cost of implementing the wildlife conservation plan, and so on. The state government must then certify that these conditions have been complied with. Only after that can the MOEFCC grant its final approval to the proposal. After this, the state government can pass an order notifying the diversion of forest land. To recap, forest land can only be used for a non-forest purpose, and we have seen what that means, with the permission of the central government. The rules under the Forest Conservation Act set out the processes that proposals for different classes of non-forest purposes must go through to seek and receive this permission. That brings us to the end of this lecture. We have learned how working plans prepared by forest departments under the supervision of the state and central governments are the primary documents that guide the administration of a forest towards goals that do not change the nature of the forest itself. And when it comes to using forest land for any non-forest purpose, we've also learned that there is a procedure that has to be followed to receive the permission of the central government. In both cases, we can observe that while the power to determine how forests are used is firmly in the grasp of governments, local communities dwelling in or on the fringes of forests do have a limited voice, whether it is in the formulation of a working plan or in a decision to divert forest land for a non-forest purpose. The remaining lectures in this module are about the rights of local communities in the governance of forests. Thank you for watching.